Welcome to the Quark and Roll podcast. I am your host, Quark Pui Lan. Today's guest is Dr. Vincent Lloyd, a professor of theology and religious studies at Villanova University. In this episode, we will talk about the development of political theology as well as his forthcoming books. Welcome to the podcast, Vincent.
Thank you so much for having me. I've so appreciated your scholarship and leadership in our fields over the years. It's wonderful to be able to talk to you.
Thank you. Now, I know that you have not just one, but two books that are forthcoming. Both are on political theology. Can you tell us why you are working on these two books?
One book is called Political Theology Reimagined. The other is What is Political Theology? These are both coming out in the fall. And the thought with each was to approach this field in a somewhat different way, but in each case, collaboratively and conversationally. So in the book Political Theology Reimagined, we brought together 20 scholars who are each working in political theology, but using different sorts of tools from decolonial studies or critical race theory, feminism, queer theory, and other adjacent fields, affect theory, and so on, and asking, how does political theology look different when the most sophisticated tools from these emerging critical discourses enter into the bloodstream of political theology? The second project, What is Political Theology, was co-authored with two colleagues. Each of the three of us approached the field from a different direction. So Luke Brotherton is a Christian theologian and Anglican priest at Oxford. Valentina Napolitano is a distinguished anthropologist at the University of Toronto. And of course, I think about religion and race. And we each were sort of developing our own views in conversation with each other, naming what's distinct about political theology when you think about it from the vantage point of anthropology. What's distinct about it when you think about it from the vantage point of Oxford Christian theology, the most sort of formal kind of Christian theology and kind of the European tradition, and what happens when you think about it from critical discourses around religion and race. So in each case, we're trying to open the conversation, trying to invite new voices in, trying to model what it looks like, to bring the most sophisticated tools into the conversation. Your book on Pacific political theologies as well, which has been an inspiration for me.
Let us first talk about Political Theology Reimagined. This book is going to come out in August 2025. You said you have 20 contributors. Now, what is the parameter or even definition when you invite people to contribute? Because as political theology can be open to many different conceptualizations.
Yes, certainly. And just going back a little bit, this book was a kind of pandemic project. It was 2020, and some colleagues and I were thinking, it feels political theology at its best is bringing together Christian theology and philosophical or critical theoretical trends. But often one side gets privileged. The sort of religious thought side, whether it's Christian or other religious traditions, that religious thought side is privileged and it's just taking a little bit from these different theories, or the theoretical or philosophical side is privileged and it's just taking a little bit from the surface of a religious tradition. And we were wondering, what would it mean to model political theology that gives equal weight to both sides? So that was one impetus. The other impetus was that it feels like there's a kind of staleness sometimes to political theology conversations when you hear the same names like Carl Schmitt, Giorgio Agamben, Jacques Derrida over and over again, which certainly had important thoughts and a place in the history of conversations about political theology. But they're not really where critical theory is today. They're not really where the cutting edge of insights into the complexities of today's world are. I think those insights are in places like queer theory, places like trans studies, Black studies, and decolonial theory. In terms of our criteria for selection, we wanted to find people who were deeply versed in religious traditions and also in these theoretical discourses. We wanted to find colleagues who were at a variety of their career stages, from people who were, at least at the start of the project, graduate students, to people who are emeritus professors, people who are working in different sorts of institutional contexts, from small universities to big, religious to secular, and people who are thinking in different national and disciplinary contexts as well, showcasing the variety and liveliness of political theology as a field at its very best.
Are the authors mostly approaching it from a Christian perspective, or you also have Muslim or Jewish scholars?
Yeah, so we have scholars who are engaging with Islam, engaging with Christianity, engaging with Jewish thought, and engaging with Buddhist thought in the volume. Oh, and then engaging with indigenous Native American spiritual practices as well. We tried to recognize the history of political theology as a field that has for a long time engaged deeply with Christianity and has developed powerful insights from that engagement with Christianity. But we also don't want to see it as a field limited to Christianity.
What kind of courses you think this book will be useful?
Yes, yeah, that's a good question and one that publishers always care about.
That's right.
Colleagues. So we're hoping that this is a book that can be used both in a humanities undergraduate classroom for students who are interested in religion and politics and want to do more than just figure out who voted for whom, which is sometimes how religion and politics conversations go. So how can we deepen those conversations in a humanities classroom for those who are excited about philosophy and theory in the undergraduate classroom, which I think can be some of the most meaningful experiences for students to have their eyes open to what it means to read Judith Butler or to read Frank Wilderson or to read Saidiya Hartman. We want to make sure that religious thought and political theology is taken seriously by those high theorists, right? They shouldn't dismiss the sort of work that happens in a political theology space just because it has to do with religion, but the kind of theoretical sophistication that's happening in the political theology space is just as powerful as the sort of theoretical sophistication that's happening in other sort of secular critical theory spaces. So that's one side, the sort of undergraduate and graduate humanities classroom, or I guess critical social sciences classroom, cultural anthropology. The other side is seminaries and divinity schools. I think it's really exciting that so many folks who are working on MDivs or working on other sorts of degree programs in that seminary divinity school context are eager to speak about issues of the day, looking for resources about how to engage with what's on the minds of their people in their communities, perhaps their future members of their congregations. And we want to offer resources for that, again, that sort of deepen the conversation, that add more sophistication to the conversation beyond who voted for whom, what was the latest op-ed in the newspaper about what evangelical Christians think, what is Christian nationalism, and so on. Now, those may be important conversations, but thinking carefully about the nuances of religious traditions, practices, emotions, affects, all of that, along with the nuances of these different insights from cultural studies, critical theory, and so on, that seems something that we ought to be offering to those folks in seminary and divinity school contexts as well.
Let us also talk about your second book. That is, What is Political Theology? Is this more kind of introductory text, or this is a redefining of the field?
Yeah, so the aspiration is to do a little bit of both. It is a question that gets asked a lot. Like when you say that you're interested in political theology, what that means varies so much depending on the different disciplinary spaces, the different sorts of cultural spaces that we move in, the different sorts of ecclesial spaces that we move in. And there obviously isn't an easy answer. If there was an easy answer, there wouldn't have to be a book about it. But there are quite different sorts of answers that people offer to this question, what is political theology? There's an old-fashioned kind of answer about, say, Jürgen Moltmann and Johann Baptist Metz and Dorothy Zola on the Christian side, or an old answer about Carl Schmitt or perhaps Agamben and Derrida on the sort of secular philosophy side. But that's not really what people mean anymore when they say that they're interested in political theology. The conversation has deepened and grown, and what political theology means in anthropology, say, where people are doing ethnographic work, immersing themselves in all sorts of different cultures, all sorts of different religious traditions, and thinking about the complex ways that affect, concept, history, and power blend together to make us think in new ways about religion and politics. That anthropological conversation about political theology is one thing. The way that Christian theologians are deepening their conversation by starting in different places, starting, say, at the Black Atlantic as a site where Christian political theology really develops as conversations about slavery, arguments about slavery are going back and forth, or the Pacific, as your work has demonstrated, what it mean for those Christian theologians to take new starting points. That's what Luke Bretherton's chapter is examining and modeling. And in my case, in my contribution to this book, I'm interested in political theory questions. What does it mean for political theology to be a left political project and not a liberal or a conservative political project? I think people these days in today's political environment sometimes hear political theology and they think something conservative, or they hear it and they think something that's managing religious difference. But there are also deep leftist roots to political theological projects when political theology doesn't just mean Schmitt or Metz-Zola. So I want to think about that. I want to think about contemporary abolitionist movements, not just a movement to abolish prisons, but a kind of ethical stance of abolitionism that developed in the 2010s and continues to take on new life. And I also want to think about new resources. What if we take someone like Aimé Césaire, the Caribbean poet, as a progenitor of political theology instead of Carl Schmitt? What would that mean about the aesthetics of political theology? What would it mean about the concepts that are at the heart of our conversations? So just to go back to your original question there, in a way, we're introducing people to three answers to this question, what is political theology? But in another way, we're also trying to move those conversations forward. For each of us, what does it mean to move the anthropology conversation to the leading edge and beyond that? The Christian theology conversation to the leading edge and beyond that, and then the religion and race conversation to that leading edge and beyond.
You have also written about the domination against the Black people. So I wonder, what do you see as the intersections between political theology and Black theology? Will you consider Black theology as a kind of political theology?
Yeah, that's a good question. At least as I use these terms, my instincts are quite pragmatic. When we're using language, we're gathering a community. We're doing it to help people notice things that they weren't noticing before. I think sometimes it's useful to think about Black theology and political theology as a part of a common project, both drawing on religious ideas to speak to challenges of power and domination in the world. Sometimes it's useful to think about them as distinct projects, right? The specificity of anti-Blackness is something that we ought to attend to, and that scholarship in Black studies over the last couple of decades has been so powerful in helping us notice that there's something about anti-Blackness that's quite different from other forms of racial oppression. And Black theology, from its origins, at its best, has been aspiring to speak to that distinction, that way in which Blackness attaches to a kind of paradigm of domination and not just one among many forms of oppression. And similarly, political theology at its best has a sort of expansiveness, and it's drawing on lots of tools, speaking to lots of different contexts, helping us complicate conversations about religion and politics that we're having across sites, and sometimes with no relation to race at all, but always with some relation to domination. So certainly related, but I wouldn't want them to always be the same, or one to be always under the umbrella of the other.
Sometimes we have a feeling that political theology is so dominated by the Europeans. We all talk about the Carl Schmitt and the Moglen and Dorothy Sola. And as I hear what you are describing about your two forthcoming books, you are really trying to broaden the horizons, the concerns, and also the dialogical partners.
Yes, certainly. And I think, just wearing an administrative hat for a minute, I've been helping to edit the journal Political Theology for something like 12 or so years now. And it's both exciting and sometimes frustrating. But it's exciting because we have the ability to gather people from across disciplines, across traditions, for cutting edge conversations that couldn't happen anywhere else. That label of political theology allows for people to think in ways that just don't have oxygen in other disciplinary spaces and other sort of ecclesial or cultural spaces. On the other hand, there's also a sort of caricature of political theology that ties it or anchors it in a very specific European tradition, as you're saying. And I don't think we should abandon that tradition. They're really powerful things that were noticed by complicated people like Carl Schmitt or Moglen and Dorothy Zola. And if we can use those tools to notice things that we would otherwise ignore, those are tools that can remain part of a healthy conversation. But they shouldn't be the only tools, and they shouldn't be the predominant tools, right? We should always be listening and learning from our colleagues to see how can we enhance and deepen these conversations, how can we push in new directions. And that's what I see, especially younger scholars and also clergy and also lay participants in conversations about political theology doing, right? They're practically drawing on a variety of sources and traditions to think in smart and critical ways about questions of religion and politics.
You said that you have been editing and working on political theology for such a long time. Given the changing political situation both domestically and globally, and especially the banning of the critical race theory or projects that support diversity, inclusivity, and what are the challenges, as you can see, for those of us who are doing theology from a particular theological perspective?
Yeah, that's a big question, and one that I think we're all trying to figure out how we can work out together, especially those of us who feel a call toward justice in the deepest sense and toward truth in the deepest sense, when we're in times where the pursuit of justice and the pursuit of truth are not valued in national political discourse. What are we to do? And if it was just national political discourse, maybe that would be okay, but that seeps down to our institutions, that seeps down to our students. It gives us more work to explain the value of the kind of scholarly inquiry that we are doing in our teaching and in our writing and in our public engagement to students and administrators. Yeah, specifically on questions of critical race theory, I think there's a challenge in that when quite technical tools in academic space or in, say, the humanities get picked up into a national political conversation or into the realm of electoral politics, the sense that they are precise tools gets lost. Right? And they come to mean different things. And I think that is the case on all sides of national politics, right? The sense that we have deep injustices locally, nationally, and internationally that we need to address, and we need the best tools to address those injustices. That seems like it ought to be self-evident, but that gets lost in these broader political conversations. And those tools get pejoratively labeled critical race theory or DEI or things like that. So that seems like something that we need to work on explaining. It's a common experience that we encounter injustice at a micro level and at macro levels. And it's common sense that we need tools to understand and respond to that injustice. How do we explain that? I think that's a somewhat separate question from the question of how do we welcome diverse voices into our institutions and our conversations, which is also an imperative, a moral imperative, an imperative of justice and truth, because we can pursue justice and truth better. We can come up with better answers, more truthful answers, when we have more diverse perspectives in the room. That is a sort of institution building question as well as a political question that is quite tricky, but also different from the kind of ideas question about what are the ideas that can serve as tools to address injustice.
I know that you are co-authoring a book with my friend, Jonathan Tran, because in an earlier podcast, when I interviewed him, he spoke about this and talked about the collaboration. You too are writing a book on race. Can you share some of the highlights of that book and collaboration?
Sure. Jonathan and I actually were just sharing some of the book for the very first time at Duke yesterday. I just got back from North Carolina late last night, and it was really fun to try out ideas to see how our two different authorial voices can come together. I think we have quite different sort of orientations toward both theology and secular philosophy and theory, but have interests in different corners of those worlds and quite different sort of ways of expressing ourselves. But I think we also have a spirit of charity and generosity as we're dealing with each other, which has been really fun to see develop as we've been working on this project, and great to get feedback from colleagues yesterday. The aim of this project is to assess state of the conversation around race and Christian theology and to see where it can go in the future, to see that there have been such powerful insights over the last half century of Christian theological work around race, around not only Black theology, but also Latinx theology, Asian American theology, all sorts of global forms of racialization, that we need to figure out how we can appreciate the power of those insights while also noticing where those powerful insights get mixed in with things that are sort of holding back the realization of those insights in a more theological idiom, right? Even the best insights about God are expressed in human ways. And so we're always grappling with the limitations of those human forms of expression, human orientations that are necessary for expressing truths about God, but also can distort or turn us away from truths about God. So the first part of the book is moving through those different movements in the development of Christian theology and race over the last half century. The second part is turning to new constructive resources that can add depth and complexity to those conversations about Christianity and Christian theology and race. Sometimes the Christian theology and race conversation can be rather insular, and we're trying to say, what does it mean when you take the ideas of someone like Sarah Coakley, Kathy Tanner, Karen Kilby, and see what they have to say about Black theology, what Black theology has to say about them. How can these really powerful projects in the Christian theological space help us move forward in conversations about race, but also what are new sources that could be tapped? How could British cultural studies, the work of Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, Hazel Carby, and others inform conversations about Christian theology and race? How can liberation theology, how can post-liberal theology, how can these various corners of the academy that haven't been tapped push forward those conversations so that we can all pursue questions of truth and justice around race together?
This is really exciting to hear. Now, Vincent, I want to ask you, what are the theological figures you are reading these days to help you to draw insights to address our time?
This is very contingent about what one happened to be reading. I'm actually just reading a biography of James Baldwin that's about to be published next month, which it doesn't really count as a theological figure, but it should, right? Baldwin is a deep thinker, not only of Christianity, but of spiritual life in times when there is pervasive domination, when there is an erasure of classes of people from the national discourse and polity in the US, which is unfortunately what we're starting to see again now in various ways, or new iterations of those sorts of erasures are coming up. I was actually just revisiting some of Catherine Tanner's work, which is trying to chart a course between some of the problematic tendencies that she diagnoses in liberal theology and in post-liberal theology. And in some ways that is echoes today, right, where it might feel like we're constrained to theological options which are each being co-opted by political parties, and which suggests that there may be genuine problems with the logics of those theologies. And so to figure out, to approach theological projects in ways that can classify them, can name their logics, give a charitable interpretation of them, and also can look for where they are not the ideal articulations of Christian scripture or a practice. That seems a skill that is very much needed today, whether or not one agrees with the particular conclusions of this or that theologian, or of Kathy Tanner in this case. It's that ability to map things out, analyze what's powerful, analyze what we need to set aside, and open up new space for new thought and practice. That seems very much needed today.
You teach in Villanova University, and now you have a very famous alum, Pope Leo. I suspect there were many conversations about the Pope. And what are your hopes for Pope Leo?
Yes, the church bells at Villanova were ringing for a very long time on that day of the selection of Pope Leo. And there's a good deal of excitement on campus. We had a group of students from my department that were in Rome a few months before the selection of Pope Leo, and he hosted them because he's part of the Augustinian community there in Rome, and we're the premier Augustinian Catholic university. So there's a deep connection between Villanova and a lot of warm feelings there. I think it's exciting that some of the pastoral sensibilities of Francis and the democratic sensibilities of Francis, in terms of listening to the insights, attending to the insights of those from a wide variety of perspectives, those whose voices have often been overlooked, those insights are being picked up and developed by Pope Leo, or at least that's the promise of the early days of the papacy. And I think it is the case that when you're managing a large organization, the challenges are quite different from when you're one among a community or when you are living and working in the world of ideas or even of students. The managerial abilities that I think probably helped fuel the selection of Pope Leo hopefully will combine with a vision of democracy and justice that he brings and a suspicion of domination that he draws from the Augustinian tradition. That's the ideal picture. But of course, Christianity goes wrong when it's identified with the most powerful Christians. Even for those in the Catholic community, it's important to see the variety of places where Catholicism comes to life and not just look to Rome for whatever problem of the day we're worried about.
Vincent, thank you very much for joining the podcast today. I can't wait to read the 2 forthcoming books. One is coming out in August, which is Political Theology Reimagined. Later in the fall would be your co-authored book, What is Political Theology? Please support the podcast Rock and Roll by clicking like, comment, and subscribe. I will see you in the next episode.
Thank you.